Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Stephen Mithen, who is a professor of early history, or prehistory, at the University of Reading, also the author of a number of books. You've got this one from many years ago called The Prehistory of the Mind, also one called After the Ice. Most recent book is called The Language Puzzle, piecing together the 6 million year story of how words evolved, which actually segues, it kind of connects very nicely with some earlier work on music. This one, which is the first book of yours that I read many years ago, called The Singing Neanderthals, Origins of Music, Language, Mind, and Body. And then there's this one called Thirst for Water and Power and in the Ancient World. Did I miss anything? Did I get them all?
There's a couple of others hanging around, really, which are quite sort of more regionally specific in a way. But that's good enough. That's quite good enough, yeah.
Well, in this book, The Language Puzzle, and the title of this book is not accidental, right? And you mentioned in the book that you had always intended to write something on a topic, but you're kind of stymied, and you're only unlocked when you considered this metaphor. And of course, metaphor makes an appearance in the book towards the end, this metaphor of the jigsaw puzzle. And you talked about how to write a book like this, you really have to have a little bit of understanding in a wide range of domains. And you talk about ethology and psychology and linguistics and genetics, and all of these disciplines make an appearance. And I think the topic of the book is really, it's language, but it's also human uniqueness, right? Because you talk about not just the evolution of language, but how language co-evolved with things like music and tool making and, dance and like all these other things. And I think a lot of people are thinking about, what it is that makes humans unique, and they're always trying to point to one thing. And I think that there's really this whole, suite of characteristics that kind of make us unique. And language is certainly in there as an integral part, but it sort of could not have evolved independently of all this other stuff. But yet there are linguists who kind of isolate language and say, this is the thing, like this is special, and all that other stuff, is interesting, but some of it is like music is superficial and cheesecake, as you say.
Well, I mean, look, I've always been fascinated in language. Language is what we use every day, and I think because we're so familiar with it, we forget what an amazing thing it is to be able to communicate with somebody, communicate your ideas. And I've always had the view that if we're going to understand the human past, our evolutionary past or our recent past, we've got to take account of language. If we think about some human ancestors, we don't really know whether they talked or not or how they communicated. I think we never really grasp their humanity, give them some sort of humanity. So I always wanted to do that. But for many years, I was really anxious about doing it because it's just such a big, complicated topic. And also, as you say, there are many, not just linguists, but anthropologists and archaeologists saying language is the only thing about the mind. It's the most important thing about being human. Nothing else matters. I never really believed that. And consequently, in my earliest book that you mentioned there, The Prehistory of the Mind, that was explicitly written to write about the evolution of the mind, avoiding the whole topic of language. We're trying to look at the idea about how we have folk knowledge about natural history, and how we have ability to make tools and can plan for the future, and we have imagination, creativity, and that sort of that sort of resolved some of those issues to me. But when it was published, there was this big review of it in New York Review of Books, and it was by Jerry Fodor, and then also Howard Gardner reviewed it. And they both said, what's missing from this book is not language, but music. I thought, cripes, that's true. Music is so fundamental to being human, probably more so than language, because, babies come into the world with this immense natural affinity with music. So I felt I had to write a book about the origin and evolution of music, and really putting that as really the basis of humanity. And I suppose it was having done that groundwork that then I felt I've got to tackle language because, it's certainly part of these building blocks. It's sort of built on these earlier foundations. And as you say, to address language, you have to address all these various disciplines because everybody's got a view on it. The geneticists have, the neuroscientists have, the anthropologists have, the archaeologists have. And I came up with the idea that it is really a bit like a puzzle. You're trying to take the important things from genetics or what they know. You're trying to see, does that fit with what we know from archaeology or what we know from the fossil record or what we know from linguistics or sociolinguistics? And somehow you've got to find all the bits that somehow fit together. And if you inject some, if they don't fit into that jigsaw, and gradually build up this picture about language. But as you do, you bring into that the human musicality, using human tool making, using human sociality, and also the physicality of the human body, the way we breathe, the way we walk, the way we see, because all the things, these are used in language and contribute to it. So the language book was really a culmination, I think, of decades of work trying to work out how the human mind evolved and what's really important to being humanity. It isn't just language. It's all of those things that you mentioned, but language, in a way, sits on top of them and brings them together and integrates them and really makes humans a very special type of animal.
Well, when we first started thinking about evolutionary biology, the critics would say, look, humans are so different from all other animals. There must be some kind of discontinuity, right? And then, of course, we started uncovering all of these, missing links and so forth. But I think people still say that about, language. They say, there's this thing, that recursion, and that makes it so unique. And there must have been some moment when, boom, we got language. But I think you describe how there's really more of a continuity, right, between other species or our ancestors and what we now think of as language.
Yeah, I think anything as complicated as language has got to have evolved very gradually, step by step, little bit by little bit, gradually changing its character, its complexity through time by both natural selection of whatever genetics we have, but also through cultural change and cultural learning. But you're right. If you look at the world around us in present day, it does look like a huge discontinuity from any other animal. I mean, if you take chimpanzees, our closest living relative, we all know we share, 98% of our DNA with them. And we can see so many continuities with things that we think are specifically human. So like bipedalism, walking two legs, well, we can see chimpanzees do that sometimes. They're not bad. You can understand how they're evolved. And our complex social systems, our relationships, our social interactions, well, we all know now that chimpanzee societies are pretty complex as well. They compete with each other, they build alliances, they fall out. They even have what we can call as warfare between communities. So we can see in terms of sociality, there's a lot of continuity there. But when you come to language, there's no question that chimpanzees are grunting and barking. They don't have anything that remotely resembles words, let alone grammar. And there just seems a huge gulf there between how chimpanzees are communicating and how we're communicating. So there has been this inclination among some anthropologists and indeed linguists, and of course Chomsky is the classic one here, to say it must have suddenly emerged. There must have been one single genetic transmission that somehow transformed some foundations for language, which they leave unresolved, into this wonderful spoken ability. Well, of course, that's nonsense. It's got to have gradually evolved step by step. And all those steps are lost in the fossil record. These are the steps taken by our ancestors, by Homo habilis out in the savannah 2.5 million years ago, and then Homo erectus that dispersed into the old world, and then Heidelbergensis, and then Neanderthals, and the Homo sapiens. And what I try to do in the language puzzle is make reasonable inferences. One might like to call them speculations or guesses, but I think they're informed inferences, about what those stages of language evolution might have been like. What were the first words? How do words change over time? When did grammar begin, and so forth? And when did we start using things like analogies and metaphors? When did abstract words develop, and how did that change the way we think? So I tried to make inferences by drawing all these different strands of evidence together to see that gradual, slow, bit-by-bit evolution of language, which is surely, then makes language just like almost any other characteristic of humans or another animal. Walking evolved slowly, bit by bit. So did our society. So did everything, really. So it puts sort of language back just as part of mainstream evolutionary biology, evolution, cultural ecology, and so forth, which is where it should sit.
Well, I think you mentioned that the Académie Française at some point banned any discussions of the origins of language. I mean, why did they do that? Because other folks, like Rousseau and I mean, people were thinking about this a lot during the Enlightenment.
Well, I think it's partly because language has always been a political issue in a sense. In that late 19th century, when these various academies in Paris and Berlin were arguing about language, there was a thread of it which is about, well, what's the original language, and is German better than French, and so forth. And there was lots of speculations around. And at some time, I think people just got a bit fed up of this speculation, and they had indeed reached a threshold where the information they had available at that time couldn't really be taken any further. We needed Darwin and Darwin natural selection. We need to discover more about the archaeological and fossil record to really take language onto the next steps. And consequently, as from about the 1960s, 1970s, we began having many more sources of information. So language research again became a positive and productive field of research, where it was possible not only to come up with theories, but actually evaluate them, if not test them, as to which explain more of the data and have more logical consistency and more satisfying. But it is fascinating to remember back in the Enlightenment, those early writers like Rousseau and my personal hero, Johann Herder, Gottfried Herder, they had, I think, fantastic ideas. And what some of the more recent writers, like Chomsky and Pink and others, they sort of forgot about their work, I think. And what I do in the language puzzle, I try to go back to some of that Enlightenment writing, where they were really struggling with the nature of humanity and the nature of language, and how they could have been this massive gulf between how animals communicated. And I think they had some great insights, actually, which I've tried to relate into the modern day, most recent research.
Yeah, I mean, some people emphasize the physical preconditions of language, like our voice box and so forth, and have speculated that other animals could have language if only they had the proper tools. And there have been efforts to teach, right, other apes and monkeys, right, how to speak, and with very, very limited success. I mean, to what extent is animal communication, should we think of it as proto-language?
Well, I think we've got to be, when I'm talking about language, I'm talking about our modern human language. I don't want any time to dismiss the complexities, the sophistication of forms of communication by other animals, whether it's apes or chimpanzees or birds or cetaceans. They are all fully evolved modern forms of communication systems that work very effectively. And they often do so with quite difficult sort of physical apparatus than we do today. I mean, if you take chimpanzees, however, there were some ridiculous, with hindsight, ridiculous and quite cruel experiments back in the 1950s to see if they could actually learn to talk, and, involved actually physically moving their mouths and their lips to get them to pronounce particular. It was ridiculous with hindsight, because we know that to speak language in the way that we're doing today, you've got to have this quite sophisticated control of your breathing, of your diaphragm, of your vocal cords, the whole vocal tract. Chimpanzees just don't have that muscle control, and they don't have the right shape of vocal tract to be able to generate this wide range of sounds. That doesn't mean how they communicate isn't quite sophisticated and fits with their lifestyle. It certainly does. And I actually think that we can see in chimpanzees some word-like qualities and some language-like qualities in how they do communicate. And that's been exposed by ethologists over the last decade, maybe 20 years, doing some really fabulous experiments in the wild to look at how chimpanzees can modulate their calls and can vary them depending on who's around and who's listening. So there are some language-like qualities in them, but it's not language. And chimpanzees don't have the physical capability to generate words and utterances in the way that we do. And one thing they lack is a consistency. To have words, they've got to be pronounced in some consistent manner so that those of the same language community can always hear and say them in the same manner. Chimpanzees lack the consistency in the sounds. They don't have that sufficient control. So with humans, it is partly this evolution of this fabulous vocal tract, this fabulous control that we have around it, which relates to, bipedalism and a range of other, and our diet and how our teeth reduce and so forth. And that was really present by at least 500,000 years ago, of an evolved vocal tract that would have been capable of speech like we have today. And I think that the next stage of that, to get to modern language, was really evolution of cognition and the brain that allowed that amazing physical apparatus to be used in a more complex and sophisticated manner.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, this relationship between bipedalism and language, and bipedalism and music also. You write about that. But I mean, we can have language without sound, right? I mean, people have sign language and so forth. And so to what extent could gesture have been an alternative means of communication with and the development of language?
Well, there's no question in my mind that throughout human evolution and still today, we use gesture as part of our communication system. I use my hands all the time, and I can't see your hands, but I can see your expression. Subtle changes in your expression when I'm speaking to you as to whether you're finding interesting or not right and so forth. So gesture, body posture, facial expression, they're critical for all aspects of language, and they always have been. And I'm sure in our evolutionary past that was also the case. And there may well have been that in the early stages of linguistic communication, gesture played a more prominent role rather than vocalization. And some people have actually argued that language initially evolved in a gestural mode and somehow it switched suddenly to a vocal mode. Now, that can't be right, because the vocal tract is a very fine piece of evolutionary apparatus. And although its basic structures evolved relating to breathing and eating, and it was modified by bipedalism, it's the fine manipulations of it we can make have got to be selected by its ability to make complex vocal sounds. So I think actually gesture has always accompanied language, but never driven it forward. Music's maybe a little bit different, really. It seems to me musical sounds we make are almost more like gestures. And I think that time of moving to bipedalism, full bipedalism at about 2 million years ago, did really make bodies hugely more expressive. And it was a time when not only body language became important, but I think dance and singing, stamping feet, slapping thighs, all of that acting as a really important way of building social bonds, of doing some sort of communication, pushed forward that social interaction and communication. And it was like a precursor to language. And I think actually music and language share a common ancient communication system that evolved around that 2 million years ago.
Yeah, I mean, in business school, we have these communication classes where we teach people to use, body language and gesture and prosody, right? And it's kind of puzzling, why people have to be taught this, right? Because I mean, have we just sort of do we now have this very artificial view of language that has evolved because most of our communication is through the text and the written word, that we've kind of forgotten how essential the physicality of communication is?
I think there might be something in that. It's not only that because we've become a very literate culture, because when you talk about language, often some people think of much to writing or using screens and so forth. I don't think it's only the prosody of language we've forgotten, but somehow we became too obsessed with grammatical rules and so forth. Because syntax, because when we chat, and when you chat every day, you often break every single syntactical rule you can imagine. If you transcribe a conversation, it's full of uhs and buts and ungrammatical phrases. And I think actually that drove some linguists down the wrong direction by becoming so focused on syntax, the structure of written phrases, and somehow imagining that's what language is about. I don't think it is. I think language is as much about the pragmatics of language, about you and me talking here and using words and phrases which have no necessarily grammatical correctness, but whose meaning is conveyed as much by my gestures, my prosody, my expressions, my surroundings, as the words themselves. It's that visceral experience of language that I suppose that children certainly have, and I suppose is sort of eroded out of us by our institutions. When we have to give a lecture or give a talk or be serious or do a job interview, then we go into this very formal framework of mind. And I think trying to lose that is really important, actually, in thinking about what language really is and how it operates.
Yeah, I interviewed a poet once who suggested that, verse played a much bigger role in our communication. And, most of our communication would have been more musical in the past. And I don't know, I mean, there's this whole, phylogeny and ontology relationship. When we think about how we communicate with children, right? Baby talk. I mean, our baby talk or, IDS, I mean, this is like very, very musical. It's very, very rhythmic. It's very, we exaggerate, I guess, the affect in our speaking, right?
Yeah, we do. I mean, that's playing lots of different roles. One is it's partly acting as a language learning mechanism because we exaggerate some phrases, we exaggerate some vowels and some consonants. And by that way, I think infants get a better access into words, where words begin and where they end, what we're emphasizing in them. But I think also there's an intuitive pleasure taken in rhythm, variations in pitch and melody that we're born with, that we come into the world with. And I think that does reflect something in the evolutionary past, where before we had words and syntax, we were really communicating by what we'd now call musicality, by various variations in pitch and rhythm, to express our emotions, to induce emotions in others. And we still slide into that, when we're in particular emotional situations or intimate situations. And that's how we sort of intuitively communicate with infants and what they can intuitively enjoy before they know any meaning of words. And then it does gradually switch into words and language as they acquire that. But prosody maintains such a key role in our language today. The meaning of a phrase with exactly the same syntax, exactly the same, can be completely different depending where you put the intonation on. So it's really important fundamental and I think very ancient past of the whole language system. The other thing about verse is I think what we've also evolved is to really enjoy words. You know, a lot of writing about language is very serious. You know, language was involved to pass on knowledge about tool making or to plan a hunt or to build social relationships. When I came to the latter part of my language puzzle, I came to the view that what people really liked about language is all the fun of language. I mean, puns. We love puns. We love word jokes. We love word games. And I think in the latter stages of human evolution, that enjoyment of language, that fun of language, really drove its development, and it's gradually spread among communities. Because language is one of the most entertaining things we can possibly do. When talking to each other, telling jokes, making puns, and so forth. So I think we should never forget the fun and the beauty of language, whatever information it's conveying. It's just a great thing to do.
Yeah, but if we think about the evolutionary advantage that you get from having language, I mean, it seems like it's primarily social, right? I mean, obviously, being able to understand the world in complex ways is great, but it seems like the superpower of Homo sapiens was their ability to organize complex social structures, right? I mean, is that really at the heart of why we kind of took off?
I think it is in the earlier stages of language. There's no question that, humans are a remarkably social species, and we've been dependent upon social cooperation throughout our evolutionary history, and the ability to build social bonds, partly by those emotion expressions that have no semantic content, but then also by exchanging information and telling stories. Hugely important. But I think we're mistaken if we think social bonding is the only role of language, or necessarily the most important. There's at least two other things that it really does. Just the transmission of information from generation to generation. What we don't see in our human ancestors, like the Homo erectus and then our relatives like the Neanderthals, is only cumulative accumulation of culture. It doesn't seem to build from one generation to the next. And I suspect that's because there is a limitation on the way they're using language and the ability to gradually construct more complex ideas. But the other way we use language, and the other important, is for thinking about complex ideas that I think we just can't do without of it. And that's where a metaphor comes in, I think, hugely important. The progress of science and any complex science ideas, they're difficult to grasp without using metaphors. I mean, if a collapsing star, we call it a black hole. Now, a black hole, I mean, can you explain to me what a black hole is? Probably not. You might be able to. I can't really explain it to you, but we can share the idea of a black hole and have some idea about something of infinite density sucking in light. And if we look at all the major developments in science, right from the Enlightenment forward, many of them based on metaphorical ideas, whether it's, Hooke looking down a microscope and seeing cells of what he called the cells of a plant, because it compared to the cells that people are in, whether it's the solar system nature of the atom, whether it's the brain as a computer, without using language in this way. And if you haven't got that capacity to think metaphorically, I think it puts a massive constraint on what we can call scientific progress. And that's partly why I think that we see a huge stasis in culture at a particular level in our ancestors. And it's only after 100,000 years or so ago, and particularly only after agriculture, that we start seeing this such rapid developments in culture and technology through time.
But you suggest even further back, right? You talk about the coevolution of tool use and language. And, it seems like there's two possible functions there. I mean, one, you talk about these experiments where, people are trying to teach other people how to do stuff, right? And, one way is to just demonstrate and have them observe, and the other is to kind of coach them with some language. And it seems like in the latter case, the transmission of knowledge is more efficient. But then there's this other idea that you alluded to just now, which is that, language gives you sort of a, I don't know, like a cloud storage of collective knowledge, right? Sort of, so, people can die and the knowledge that would have been in their brains can continue in ways that, would otherwise be much more difficult.
Yes, that's right. With tool-making, early tool-making, this is, if we go back in the early human past, the first stone tools were simple older one choppers. These are just nodules of stone with flakes removed from them. They did have some technical skill to make, but Greg, I'm sure you could learn to make one just by watching somebody else do it. You could watch carefully and observe how they orientated the stone, how they used the hammer stone, how hard they struck it. I think you could do that without using any language. You'd pick it up. Whether we get to a stage of tool making where verbal instruction becomes critical is much debated. By about 1.5 million years ago, people are making these very beautiful bifaces called hand axes. These take a lot more skill to make. They need lots of different stages: preparation, removal of flakes, refinement. There's an imposition of form. And some have argued that that stage requires actually linguistic communication to teach somebody how to do it. Now, I'm a bit skeptical because I think if it does, the amount of language communication is pretty limited. It involves a bit of pointing, saying hit there rather than that, hold your hammer not so hard. I don't think it's a really complex communication.
It could be gestural, like,
It could be gestural. About what
which you don't see with the apes, right? So we know that they can transmit things like, okay, you use this stick to go, get the ants, but you don't see them saying, "Hey, check this out!" Like, watch what I'm doing, right?
Yeah, there's hardly any, and what do exist are very controversial instances of actually teaching of how to do something, whether using language or not. There may be some cases of mother chimpanzees who are placing nuts on anvils, sort of facilitating their infants cracking them with stones. But there's nothing of didactic teaching there. But even in living hunter-gatherers, modern humans, we don't see much formal teaching. Most of the transmission of knowledge there is by observation, by trial and error. There's very little formal didactic teaching going on. Language is much more used for storytelling, for chatting, for passing information between adults about the hunts and so forth, rather than actually teaching children. So I think we can become a little bit over-exaggerate the significance of the role of language in teaching. But the other connection of stone tools is that making a stone tool might use the same brain processes as constructing a verbal sentence.
So, this is an example of recursion. So you see so it's like routines, subroutines, and then building up to complex.
It could well be that. Yeah. It could be well that. If we make a utterance, even not recursion, but if I make an utterance, some sort of, combining some verbs and some nouns, some adjectives, I'm putting them in a particular order. And if I'm making a stone artifact, it's actually a hafted artifact. I've got to get the haft and the resin and the twine. I've got to get the stone point. They all need preparing. They may need put together in a particular way, just as how I have to put my words together in a particular way. So some argue that there is a neurological overlap between making complex artifacts and making complex utterances. I'm quite persuaded by that. I would be as an archaeologist, because that means that you can somehow track the increasing complexity of language by the increasing complexity of technology in the cultural record.
Yeah, I interviewed someone who wrote a book on coding, and they said that coders they get into this fugue state almost, right? Where they're constructing this very complex piece of code where you have, these little pieces and they all have to stack together. And, if you interrupt them in the middle, the whole house of cards comes falling down. And it seems like that's the same mental process that you have when you're when you're constructing something physically, right? I mean, that has to be done in this complex way. But you also talk about the coevolution, and I think this is probably the most speculative part of the book, coevolution of fire and language. And we know the role that fire may have played in building brain matter, right, because of nutrition. But you also said that, at nighttime, all of a sudden people are sitting around talking in ways that perhaps they would not have if they didn't have this fire to protect them from predators.
Well, Greg, fire is a very strange topic archaeologically, because the evidence is sort of almost contradictory. As you said just now, there's been really strong arguments from Richard Wrangham and others that the ability to cook food early on in evolution enabled us to digest it easier. It means we could reduce our digestive tract, release metabolic energy for expansion of the brain. Brilliant idea, but we can't really find the evidence for it, because the first strong evidence for a recurrent controlled use of fire is not until about 400,000 years ago. Now, that's long after large brains had evolved. It's long after people had spread into northern environments, living almost in tundra environments, without seemingly any sophisticated control of fire. So there's still a huge paradox between the really compelling ideas about the use of fire for cooking food, for brain evolution, and what the evidence is actually telling us, that it wasn't until late Homo heidelbergensis, the early Neanderthals, that they really begin to control fire and making actual fireplaces recurrently in hearths in the same locations, and probably using them to extend the day, to cook food as a social focus. So it comes quite late in the human evolution. The extent of whether that is because, people just had more to say. They wanted to extend the light, the day. They wanted to continue chatting, or the extent to whether that was part of social changes where people were beginning to recurrently use places, return to places, tell stories, communicate, which itself then provided a spurt to the evolution of language is rather debated. So it's a very, very odd topic. But I think once we see caves such as Kabara which Neanderthals are using in Israel now, or the early caves in South Africa, like at Classy River mouth and Blombos, and you get these well-built fireplaces stacked up on top of each other again and again. It's a really compelling idea that people are sitting around there, that talking around there. And I suspect that the atmosphere created in these caves of flickering lights, of smoke and so forth,